We'll do a review of likutei sichos and Tes in volume 29. This is the second sicha for the Parshas Teitzei. In the Parsha, it talks about making vows. The pasuk says not to make vows, and we're going to discuss from the Gemara, from the Rambam, that there is a problem with vows. The Rebbe in the sicha is going to analyze the Rambam, going to ask a lot of different questions, and the Rebbe is going to explain that there's a difference between an ordinary vow, the problems that we have just making a vow to prohibit yourself something, or sometimes there's also a vow for tzedakah, and that in a way is not as the regular vows. It's not the same level. The Rebbe is going to explain the problems, and the Gemara says, Rambam brings down quite uh, serious offense by doing a vows. What's the problem with the vows? It's considered like boinabama and makrivam, and almost seems like a vow is something maybe that should be okay. And the Rebbe is going to explain a lot of details and insight into all the different vows, and this explains also the Rambam very beautifully. But we'll go step by step. We're learning Lilo Nishmas Rav Levi Yitzchok ben Rav Chaim Tzvi Tehei Nishmos Yitzrura B'Tzrei Chaim. Aleph. So in our parsha is the pasuk that talks about neder. The Gemara zogt. So this is from the Gemara in the Dorim. Kol ha-neder, anybody who makes a vow, make a promise. You make a vow. Afal pishu mekaime, even though he fulfills and he does what he promised. Of course, if one violates his promise, then there's a violation of the verse. The Torah says you have to fulfill your promise. If you violate it, it's an aveira. But even if you fulfill your vow, says the Gemara, Nikra Chayta, he's still called a sinner. If you vow and you fulfill your vow, you're still a sinner, because you should not. I mean, of course, you should do what you want to do, but not to make a vow. If you vow, and even if you do it, you're still called a sinner. Amar Rab Zvid Maikro, says Rab Zvid, where's the verse to support this, that even when you do a vow, you are still considered committing a sin? Amar Rab Zvid Maikro, where's the pasuk? Because in our parsha it says, "V'chiserda lindoir lo yiyeh b'chol chet." It says if you will stop making vows, you won't have a sin. Not doesn't say if you're not going to do your vows. It says if you stop making vows, which means if you don't stop, you make vows, there's a sin. There's a sin associated just with making the vow. One should not make a vow. And soon we'll see what's the reason why one shouldn't make a vow. So that's one pasuk. We also learned this in the Gemara earlier in the Dorim. The Gemara learns out from Agzera Shove, Chodlo, Chodlo. The word Chodlo, Chodlo, we learn Agzera Shove. Ksiv Hocha, in our pasuk again, it says, Kisachdal Lindoir. Oksiv Hasam, there's a pasuk in Eiv. The pasuk says there Shom Rishoyim Chodlu Roiges. So here it says the Lashon Chisardal, and over there it says there is pasuk Shom Rishoyim Chodlu Roiges. So the word Chodlu is Agzei Rishava. Just like over there Chodlu is Rishoyim, over here Sardal is also Rishoyim. Askola Noider Ava Pisha Mekaimo Nikra Rosha. That anybody who makes a vow, even though he fulfills the vow, is still called a Rosha. Making vows is considered a Rosha. To make a vow, you consider a Rosha. So here it says quite clearly in the Gemaras, and we have also support from the Psukim, from the Gemara, that making a vow, even if you fulfill the vow, Just making a vow is a sin. He's called a Rasha. And now the question will be, how come the Rambam doesn't bring down these two Gemaras against making a vow? And the Rambam actually brings us third Gemara, something different. Not these two cases, but another thing of the Gemara. Beidel Lemudim, but these two, what we learn out from the Pasuk, they're brought down in halacha with the Tur v'Shulchan Aruch. It says, Kol hanoider, afal pisha mekayme, anybody who makes a vow, even though he fulfills his vow, nikra Rasha v'nikra chayte. Now he's called the Rasha, as we see in the second Gemara that Rabbi brings down, and is also called a chayte, as we see in the first Gemara that Rabbi brought down, Holo chadal tikra chayte, and also afal pisha mekayme nikra Rasha. So we see in the Tur v'Shulchan Aruch saying for a person to make a vow is a chayte and a Rasha. The Rambam but the Rambam, however, doesn't bring down these psukim of chayte and Rasha, but rather he brings down in the laws of Nedarim another pasuk. The Rambam over Aleph bringt nit arop in Hilchos Nedarim de Lamudim Hanal. He doesn't bring down in the laws of Nedarim this studies that we learn from the pasuk v'chisach dal linder and the Gzeira Shava, the Mudmanal. So he doesn't bring them down. That is a chayte and a Rasha. Beis, but on the other hand, bring Tarap Adrit Maimer Hazal. He brings down a third saying of our sage of blessed memory. About the lacking, the problem, what's wrong with making an eder. In the end of the laws of Nedarim says the Rambam, if you make a vow, says the Rambam, another idea, it's like building a bama. We know that one is supposed to bring all the karbanis only to the Beis Hamikdash. In the olden days, before the Eibishter chose Yerushalayim, and that became the place to bring the karbanis, people were allowed for a while to make a bama, to build up a altar in their backyard and make a high place and bring the carbon there. But after the Eibishter chose Yerushalayim, the Beis Hamikdash, the Makom Hamikdash, over there, as we learned in the parasha, over there the Eibishter chose to bring all the karbanos over there. You're not allowed to bring in a bama anymore. But if you go and you make a neder, it's like you're building a bama. You're building a bama which is prohibited. What exactly, the Rebbe will explain later on what's the connection to a bama from the Ram very beautifully. We'll see that later. But right now, the Rambam just says, if you make a vow, it's like building a bama. Meaning you're not doing a mitzvah. You're building a bama for the Eibishter, for a korban, but that's not a mitzvah because you're not allowed to bring. And we'll see soon it's considered like you're bringing on the bama. So first you build it, and if you're gonna make a vow, it's like doing an avera. It's like doing a bama. The im over v'nodar. If a person made a vow, he needs to absolve himself from the vow. Mitzvah lishoel nidra. The mitzvah is to go to the Rav and make hataras nedarim, absolve yourself from the vow. Person shouldn't make the vow in the first place. But if he violated and he did make a vow, he should absolve himself of the vow. He should shoyl to find a Pesach HaTorah so that he doesn't have the vow on him. So here the Rambam brings another Maimer Chazal outside of the two places of the Gzeir Shova and Kiserdal Halachoda Nikrachoita and Rosh. Tzarich Biur. So we need to explain. Needs explanation. Why does the Rambam not bring the above lessons that we learn that are based on verses? Not he brings Kol HaNeder Chulu. He brings a saying of our sages in the Gemara, in many places in the Gemara, but there's no verse to support this. So why would he not, if he wants to tell us that a person shouldn't really make a vow, so why does he find a Maimer Chazal that doesn't have a pasuk? Why not bring down these two psukim, that these two Maimer Chazal that have psukim to it? Okay, so that's the question. In the Rambam basically says the same concept as the Gemara says, that you're not allowed to, you shouldn't really make vows. But the Rambam brings a different Gemara than these Gemaras. A Gemara doesn't have a pasuk to say that it's considered like building a bama, something not good, as opposed to bringing the Gemara, which is called Achaita and Arasha, which have support from psukim. Why does the Rambam not bring them? This idea, in essence, about not making vows, the Rambam was already brought down before in Hilchos Deis, when he talks about the behaviors of people. He says not to make vows, and there too, the Rambam seems to be using a different reason for not doing it, not using this case of Bama over there. We also need to understand this concept that vows are not a good thing. That one should hold back and not make vows. The Rambam already has said this earlier in the laws in which he brings down of the conduct of a person. He talks about how a person should generally conduct themselves in the world, in worldly matters. Behavior, proper behavior. There are certain behaviors a person should separate himself from, and some that he does not need to. He can go. Those are general behaviors that the Rambam discusses there. The Rambam brings down over there Vizel Shayna, and quoting the Rambam, Lefikoch tzivu chachomim. That's why our sages instructed shelo yimna odom atzmoi. A person should not prevent himself only from those items that the Torah has prevented him. But don't add and prohibit upon yourself by making vows, by making swearing on things that are permissible. The Rambam says the proper conduct is not for a person to bring on upon himself new prohibition, new isurim, by swearing and by making vows. Shouldn't do so. And he brings down our Yerushalmi, the Rambam. Kachomru chachomim. So said our sages. Loi dayach masha osra Torah. Is it not sufficient for you that which the Torah is prohibited? But you're adding upon you other things. No, don't do that. So the Rambam quotes from the Yerushalmi this concept also of not making vows, but the Rambam again over there uses Yerushalmi another rationale by saying that we should not add more to them with the Torah, since the Torah said this was allowed, and you're coming and making it prohibited through your neder or your shvua, you're making it prohibited. That's the wrong thing to do, because the Eibishter allowed it. You should not be not allowing it on yourself. This is a third rationale, not from the Gemara, not what the Rambam says here. Why doesn't the Rambam take a more serious, a more severe point and say that you shouldn't make the vow, not because of the Yerushalmi, but what he says over here, that kol ha-neder, if you're making a vow, it's like building a bama. Is neglatik. So the Rebbe is asking, Pavos bringt nicht dorten dem Chisorn in Nidorim the Mamorim Hanal? Why does he not bring down over there the problem, the lackings by a person making a neder or a shvua in Nidorim the Mamorim Hanal of the above mentioned sayings? As we say that the first two Gemaras that we have, that the Rambam doesn't bring down the other Nidorim either. Kol ha-neder nikra choyte pesheya, that if you're neder, you call the choyte pesheya. These two statements in the Gemara, b'chadalto and the gzeir shava, that is choyte da pesheya. And the second one that he does bring down, kilubana bama, that he brings in the Nidorim. Was ist doch strenger von der Teine lo yidaychlu. That is a more serious than the argument. Isn't enough what the Torah asked? Yeah, that's an argument. But why does the Rambam bring a stronger objection to a person making vows upon himself? Not only because isn't it enough what the Torah says? Why are you adding? But to tell you that there's a statement that says that that's like building a bama. That's mamash and aveda. Or the Gemara we quoted before, it says this is a chet. It's called a rosha, pesheya. So why does the Rambam not say that? So first, the Rebbe is trying to understand why the Rambam just brings down the kol ha-neder ki lebona bama, which is bad, but it doesn't have a pasuk. Why doesn't he bring down the two Maimorim in the Gemara of Nidorim? The first one in Daf Ayin Zayin, and the second one, the Gzeir Shav, is on Nidorim and Chav Beis. Why doesn't the Rambam bring down the Gemara in Nidorim Ayin Zayin and the Gemara in Nidorim Chav Beis? But he does bring down the famous Maimer, which is mentioned many times in different places. So why does the Rambam choose to bring down that limud? And then in Hilchos Deis, where the Rambam already spoke about the negativity of making vows, over there he uses the Yerushalmi B'chlal. Why doesn't he bring down any of these psukim from the Gemara, Nidorim, Ayin Zayin, Chav Beis, or the Gemara of Bama? What's going on over here? The Rebbe will sort it all out and see when we see what's the problem, what is the meaning of Bama, and what's the problem in each case, and what exactly we're talking about. That it will be clarified why the Rambam says what he says, what the Gemara says, what the Gemara says, and also what the Rambam says in Hilchos Deis, as we'll continue to see. But first, the Rebbe explains the Gemara that the Rambam brings down, that ki'ilu you built a bama. And really, we quoted only that part of the Gemara, and the Rambam quotes the Gemara. If you make a vow, it's like building a bama. And the Rambam only tells you that if you did make a vow, you must try to, as we learned before, quoted from the Rambam, you must try to annul it so you don't keep the vow. But the thing is, in the Gemara, there is a continuation. The Gemara says, and if you don't annul your vow and you stick to your vow, then it's not just like building a bama, then it's like bringing a korban on the bama. Building the bama, you haven't yet done anything wrong because you're just preparing it to make an offering outside of the Beis Hamikdash and the bama. That's not allowed, but you didn't do it yet. But if you keep it and you don't, so you still got a chance to annul it. But if you don't annul it and you sustain it, you keep it, then it's like you brought a korban. That's how severe the Avera is. That's from the Gemara. The Rambam doesn't bring down that second part. The Rambam only brings down the first part, that if you make a vow, it's like building an altar. And one must, if he made a mistake and he did make a vow, he must absolve himself from the vow so that he doesn't stumble over it. And that's it. But he doesn't go on to say, if you keep it, it's like bringing a korban. Why did the Rambam not bring down? The Rebbe wants to explain, based on this question, how we're going to stand the whole idea. Base. Wird man das verstehen, behagdim, biur divrei harambam in der Halacha Mal, by explaining the Rambam's words in the above Halacha. The Rambam in the end of Hilchos Nedarim talks about a person should not make vows. What does he say over there? He says, Kol ha-noider ki'ilu bana bama. If you make a vow, that's like building this bama, which is not allowed to bring a korban there. But v'im avar v'nodar, if he did transgress, he did make a vow. Mitzvah lishol nidri. Then it's a mitzvah for him to ask and try to absolve himself from the neder. Why? Because once we have a neder, he's obligated to keep it. And he might not keep it. So that this should not provide a stumbling for him. He might trip over it. He might, by accident, violate his neder. So the Rambam says you shouldn't keep the neder. But don't make the neder. But if you did make the neder, then make sure to absolve yourself. Be shoyel, so that you don't have a constant neder over there in front of you that you might stumble over it. That's the end of this halacha in the Rambam. But in the Gemara, there's a whole other piece over there. The Gemara says that if you did not absolve yourself from the neder, and you kept the neder, then it's like bringing not only the building, but that's like bringing an offering, a korban b'chutz on the bama. The mocker from the halacha in the Maimer is the Maimer for Rabbi Nosson. What is the source of the halacha of the Rambam? Ki lebona bama is the statement of Rabbi Nosson. Was wird gebracht kama pamim b'shas. It's brought down many times in the Gemara. The Rebbe in the Ora 12 brings down a bunch of places, the Gemara in the Dorim, and in other places which this is brought down, the statement of Rabbi Nosson. But Rabbi Nosson firtois, but Rabbi Nosson concludes the statement in the Gemara. That conclusion we don't find in the Rambam. What does the Rabbi Nosson conclude? If you do not absolve yourself from this neder, you're not shoyel on neder. If you sustain it, is ki'ilu hikriv korban. You built a bama before just for making the violation, but when for making a vow, and now if you keep it, then it's as if you brought a korban on the bama. Why does the Rambam omit the second part of it? Isn't it? Move on. So we don't understand. Was bringt nicht der Rambam euch der Siyum von der Meiler? Why doesn't he bring the end of this statement? Was bringt noch mehr heraus dem Goydlachet? That even expresses, it brings out even further, even more, the great sin. If you don't ask to absolve from this vow, tells you that it's like bringing a korban debam. If you're not asking, that means you're sustaining it because you did not absolve yourself. You did not ask to be absolved. So this brings out as when the severity of the sin, as when mekayim the neder, is ki'ilu mi is makri v'korban v'debama. It's as if you would be offering an offering on this bama. Why does the Rambam, who wants to tell us how bad it is to make vows, and he brings down like building the bama, why doesn't he bring down the end of the statement, which says that it's if you offered on the bama, which is even a step further to express how severe it is to make vows and not to absolve yourself from the vows. Noch better. Furthermore, in Tur v'Shulchan Aruch, Verdos Yarov gebracht. That is actually brought down. So, why does the Rambam not bring down that if you don't absolve yourself and you sustain that vow, is like bringing a korban on the bama, which is a bigger aveda? If the Rambam is trying to bring us how severe it is. The Rebbe brings down from the Radvaz now, the Radvaz actually trying to explain the Gemara. The Gemara doesn't really mean it that you must absolve yourself, and if you don't absolve yourself, then you're going to be like you brought an offering on the bama. That's conditional, as the Radvaz explains. If the person is actually confident that he can keep his neder without failing, without violating it, then he said then he should keep it. He should not absolve himself from the neder. If he made a neder already, he should keep the neder. Why? Because he doesn't have to worry about it. He knows for sure that he's going to do it. This that Reb Nosson says, that quotes the Gemara, that if he wasn't absolved himself, it was like bringing an offering, is talking about a person who's not sure if he's able to stick it out with his vow. Over there, we're saying that he should, if he doesn't absolve himself, then he's like bringing a offering on the bum. So B'meila, the Radvaz is basically saying that the Rambam doesn't bring down the end because it's not so pushing. The Gemara that says that it's like offering on the bum if you don't absolve yourself isn't so pushing. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And that's why the Rambam doesn't bring it down. The Radvaz is Masvir. The Radvaz explains, as the Hemshech HaMaimer for Rabbi Nosson, the continuation of the statement of Rabbi Nosson, and one who sustains it is as if you brought the korban on the bama, from Rabbi Nosson's Maimer, is the Rambam Mefarish B'Ofen Zed. The way the Rambam explains it is as follows: as im hu yore shemo yovoy lidei michshoil umekayim nidroi ve'enei shoil alav. If he is fearful that he might come to a stumbling, and still he sustains his vow, and he's not asking for absolvement, then haviki ilu hikriv aleya korban. Then it's as if you brought a korban on the bama. Avalim bari loy shelo yavel idei michshoel. But if he is certain that he will not stumble, if he wants to sustain it and not absolve himself, let him sustain the neder, and that's okay. It's not a problem. So the Rambam learns that Advas doesn't bring it down because he doesn't say that this is a must. And therefore the Rambam can't bring down and say for everybody that you must absolve. If you don't absolve, then it's like bringing a korban on the bama. No, that doesn't apply to everybody. He knows that he's going to be able to keep his vow, and therefore it's not like bringing a korban on a bama, and therefore the Rambam doesn't bring it down. That's the way that Advaz learned. But the Rebbe says that in the Rambam cannot be interpreted as in this way. You're trying to make here a distinction between what kind of a person it is. But if he's a person that knows that he can withstand it, then he's okay. But what about, and if he's not, what about in the first case? So when the Rambam said, L'chatchila, anybody who makes a vow is like building a boma, not sustaining it, but just making the vow in the first place. He must be talking about everybody. He's talking about any person, because he's telling you not to do it. So it means that nobody should do it. There's no distinction there between if you can or not. So if in the first case, which the Rambam is talking about, he's saying that everybody who makes kol hanoider, anybody who makes a vow is doing the wrong thing. You're building a bomo. Logically is what he follows through, and he says, all these people that I told you, nobody should make a bomo. Doesn't make a difference. If they did make a bomo, they need to ask and not go through with it. Why would we make all of a sudden a distinction? Oh, this part of the Rambam is only talking about if those people who can't stick to their vow, to their promise to keep it. It doesn't see any reason for this distinction. How could we say that the Rambam's second part is only talking about a person who is who's fearful, but not somebody who knows that they can do the vow? Rambam doesn't make such distinctions there. And generally, the Rebbe says, how could we say a person knows for sure that he's not going to stumble? How could you know for sure? Let's look inside. It's not smooth to interpret the Rambam like the Radvaz wants to say that when that who is the one that needs to, that when the Gemara says that it's like sustaining it is like building, like offering on the bama, but the Rambam is talking about someone who is confident that he can do it, then it's not like building a bama, but it doesn't say so in the Rambam. In the Rambam Aleph, from Pashtus Loshen HaRambam, from the simple language of the Rambam, Kol hanoider ki lebona bama. Anybody makes a vow is like building a bama. V'im over v'nodar, and if he violated and he made a vow, mitzvah l'shol anidrei, it's a mitzvah to try to absolve yourself. We're talking about the same people that we said you shouldn't make another. Is mashmas kishem v'derei sheret. Just as in the first case of kol hanoider, he's talking about whom? Wegen jednej von neder. He's talking about all kinds of neder. Kol ha-neder. Whether you're a person that knows you can do it or you can't do it, but no. In the beginning, there's no distinction. Kol ha-neder. Nobody should make a neder. So then, when he says in afterwards, Vim Ovar, so that means also when he continues, Im Ovar Vinodar, so this would mean in every case. Sai by Yere Shemo, whether you're afraid that you might fail or not. Unsai Oich, by body loichulu, he too, even if you know for sure. Still, you have to absolve yourself. Not like the Radvaz says that if you know that you can do it, you don't have to absolve yourself. And that's why the Rambam doesn't bring down the rest of the Gemara. No. It's one flow. The Rambam says no one should make a neder. And any one of those who no one should make a neder, if he made the neder, needs to absolve himself without making a distinction that a person who knows he can do it is okay, can keep the neder. Doesn't say that. It's not mashma. Beis, the idea is that the one who knows he can do it, how could there be such a thing? We can zayin bori loy shelo yovel de michshol. How could he be sure that he's not going to stumble? The Balda Zamru Chazal, the Mishnoso. Sages tells in the Mishnah, Al tamim ba'atzmacha. You don't believe in yourself. Uzom ya'aset sich stellen b'nisoyin. They prohibited a person putting himself into a test. That means that there is no guarantees. Nobody can say for sure that they can withstand, they're not going to fail. That's not something that a person can say with any degree of certainty. So therefore, everybody should seemingly absolve himself. And if he doesn't absolve himself, because of the fear that he might violate, it's like if he's offering a carbon on the bama. Like the Gemara says, so why doesn't the Rambam say it? So the answer of the Radvaz that the Ramban is talking about in a place where the person knows that he can do it, and therefore he doesn't bring down the second part of the statement of Rab Nosson, that it's like if you built if you offered on the Bama, doesn't really fit. Besides the fact that the Rebbe says one can never be sure, so nobody should ever build even if you made it, you should not even sustain it, even if you think that you could keep your promise, because a person should not trust himself. And therefore, it should be that it's like bringing a carbon on the bum. If you don't, as Rab Nosson says, why does the Rambam not say that? Ois Gimel. So just to review, in Ois Aleph, the Rebbe question why the Rambam brings the statement of Reb Nosson of Kol HaNoider Ki Lubon Obama, and not the other two statements of the Gemara in the Dorim. Then the Rebbe started in Ois Beis trying to understand why, when the Rambam does quote Rabbi Nosson, he just brings down the first part, and he doesn't bring down that what happens if you do not absolve yourself, then it's like bringing an offering on the Bama, which is the end of the Gemara. Why does the Rambam not bring the end? And the Rebbe brought the Radvaz, that the Radvaz says that doesn't really apply in all cases, because if a person knows that he could fulfill his promise, then he could keep it, and that's why the Rambam doesn't bring it. But the Rebbe says it's not mashma in the Rambam that the Rambam, we don't find the distinction, and who can say for sure they're going to keep promise? So what we still need to understand now that we're discussing now is why the Rambam doesn't bring down the conclusion of the statement of Rabbi Nosson that if you don't absolve yourself from the vow, then it's like bringing the offering on the bama, not just building it, but bringing the offering. Why doesn't the Rambam say it to point out how severe making a vow and not absolving yourself from it? So now the Rebbe is going to explain that maybe because the Rambam includes in these vows kol hanoider, he's including even making a vow for a mitzvah. There's a vow, you just vow, I'm not going to eat something, I'm going to do something which has no connection to a mitzvah. What happens if you make a vow, you're going to give tzedakah, you're going to do something positive for Kedusha? Over there, we will see that that is an exception. That the Rambam says one should not absolve himself from a vow for Kedusha. So the Rebbe is explaining, perhaps, in the Gemara, when it talks about Noider, it's talking about Stam. You make a vow, not for a mitzvah, not for Kedusha. So over there, if you don't absolve yourself, then it's like bringing an offering on the bama. But since the Rambam says here kol hanoider, and he wants to include in kol hanoider not only plain stuff that you're making a vow for, but he wants to include also mitzvahs. So over there, as the Rambam himself says, you can't say that if you don't absolve, it's like, because over there you should not absolve yourself. Let's look inside. Gimel, l'chayre kemen das verantworten al pitiuk lashon Rambam. L'chayre, we can answer this based on the exact lashon of the Rambam, kol hanoider keilu bona boma. It says kol hanoider, nit vi bekame mekoymes b'shas, not like in the many places in the Gemara. Al derech ze in Shulchan Aruch, wo steht hanoider, it doesn't say kol hanoider. Hanoider stam. The hanoider stam is talking about not for Kedusha. But Vashloimar Kavonas HaRambam was that. What does the Rambam mean? So we were left with the question on the Rambam, since the Rambam writes that anybody who makes a vow, whether it is for tzedakah, for hegdish, or it's for stam isurim, it's kilu boin lebona bomo, which is a negative. So how come we saying that after the fact, only by isur he would have to? The Rambam says, by medvorim amurim, by isur he must absolve himself, but by hegdish he should fulfill it. Nedor el Hashem Hashalom. Why don't we say that he should absolve himself and take away that stumbling block? The Rebbe will go through now a whole explanation what is accomplished through a neder, that the person, and the connected, the Rebbe will explain why it's connected to a bama, that the person through his vow creates an object. The vow makes a chalois of an object. The vow is two parts. It creates an obligation for the person, but it also creates an object. The difference is By an Isur, it creates an object of an Isur, and that's where you got to absolve it. By Hekdesh, you're creating an object of Hashem. You made a holy object over here. So therefore, there's no reason to absolve them, as the Rebbe will conclude in the sichos. The Rebbe now first is going to explain to us this whole idea that the vow, there's two parts to the vow. There is one part of the vow that the person obligates himself. It's the gavra, the doer, the person. And then is what the object. And the Rebbe explains what's unique by a vow, that a vow creates also an object. Because sometimes there is a shavua. You swear. A shavua is only on the person. It's on the gavra. A shavua doesn't create an object. And therefore, the comparison to a bama that the Gemara brings down and that the Rambam brings down, it only applies to a neder. A bama, the Rebbe will bring down from the Ran, a bama is an object. So that's why we're saying only with regards to a neder we find it's considered like a bama, which is an object, versus by a shavua, we don't say, well, if you make a shavua, it's like you built a bama. No, because the comparison to a bama is because there's an object there. An object is only by a neder. And the Rebbe will explain the likutei sichos. Let's go step by step now. So the Rebbe says we can explain in all this by introducing. Then first the Rebbe wants to point out that the kilu bona bama, the Rambam only uses, and in the Gemara, it's only used with regards to neder, not shvua, which tells the Rebbe that there is something which a shvua obligates the person, and a neder makes a chalois of a cheptza, as the Rebbe will bring down from the Ragachover. This idea, as if you built a bama, zog the Rambam says, unazoi steht in Gemara, and that's the way it's stated in the Gemara. Nor legabi nedorim. This only appears when we talk about a neder. If you make a neder, the Gemara says it's like building a bama. Kol haneder. That's the loshon of the Rambam. Kol haneder. All about neder, nedorim. Aber nit legabi shvuos, not with regards to a shavua. Person makes a promise, makes a shavua. Now, shavuos and nedorim have a lot of things in common. We mention them continuously, but not with regards to a bama. A bama, we only talk about neder. Afal piyas become a mekoymis and hilchos nedorim. Even though that in many places, laws of nedorim bring the Rambam zeh zusammen, the Rambam bunches them together. Neder and Ashvua, Hanoider oy hanish b'chulu. Nochmer, and even furthermore, in Hilchos Deis, in the laws of Deis, wo der Rambam red Kenal, the Rambam speaks about wegen dem Chesorn von Aser und Evzich, about the fault of a person prohibiting on himself dvorim amutorim, things that are permissible, is a koilen nedorim u'shvuos. So Zaman, he also includes nedorim u'shvuos. But with regards to a bama, it's only with regards to neder. Even though in other places shvuos and nedorim are together, when we talk about bama, it's only neder. Vis is muchach in soif hilchos shvuos, and you see this in the land of shvuos. The Rambam also says about not making the shvuah. It doesn't say bama there, but the Rambam is v'toiv v'gedoylehi la'odam shelo b'klal. This is tremendous benefit. It's tremendous good for a person not to swear at all. If he violated and he swore, which is similar language that we're quoting the whole time. So regards to a neder, he did make a vow. And what did he swear? She's tired that he's going to paint himself whenever he's make a shvur over there. So the Rambam doesn't say as if he built a bama. So you see clearly in the Rambam that it's only with regards to a neder. First, the Rebbe says in all the Gemaras, it's always talking about neder. Here, when it comes in the Rambam, even though the Rambam always talks about neder and shvua, here it says specifically neder. And when you look in the laws of shvuas, which he talks about the same thing, you shouldn't make a shvua. He doesn't say that if you made a shvua, you should kilubano bama. Doesn't say that. Why? Is a simon that somehow it only applies to another. Why? The Ragachover is das mevayer. The Ragachover explains this. The gabe shvua who the isur gavro v'loichal ha'isur al shum davar. When we talk about a shvua, which is only a prohibition, the person makes a shvua for himself. It's a prohibition for the person. There's no object that the isur rests on. There it doesn't fit to say building a bama. A bama means you created something, a cheftza, but here it's only the person. The isuru hashvua v'loy davar achar. Over here, the isur is just a shvua. It's the person making the shvua. There's no chalois. It doesn't rest on anything else. The Rebbe explains. That's Barabuza. In dem Tama Dover Favos Mizokt as der was tut a neder is ki'ilu bona bama. Why do we say that if you make a neder, you do a neder, it says building a bama? What's the comparison? Zok the Ran says, Nira be'enai, it seems to me the lahochi midaminon lo leboina. This is the reason why we're comparing it to building bama, to building a bama. Mishum de sol likadaita. Why do we say building a bama? Because one may think building a bama seems like doing a mitzvah. You bring a bama to make a korban. The Eibishter says make a korban in the Beis Hamikdash, but there could be a salka daitach. Maybe I'll build a bama in my home. In a bama, that's why we compare the person who is making this vow to building a bama. Mishum the solika daita the noider, because the mind of the person making a vow, he wants in his mind the mitzvah covered. He says, I'm doing a mitzvah. The Rachmonon Asrinoi B'miladi Isura. The Torah gave him prohibitions. So he says, I'm adding. The Ran says the person can think he's doing a good thing. So what are we giving him an explanation? One of them Zokman, that's what we say about this. The Toy. You're making a mistake. The Adraba Leboine Bama Domi. We can compare you to building a bomb. The Nihi, the Rachmona Azhare La Kruvi. Korban is bifnim. Because let it be. The Torah Taka tells you that you should bring korbanis in the Beis Hamikdash. So you think you're building a bomb. I'm building something for the Beis Hamikdash. I'm being for korbanis. But the Torah told you to bring it bifnim. But Azhare, the Torah warned you, the loy loisif olei. Don't add to that which is inside in the Beis Hamikdash, livnes b'mol hakriv b'chutz, to build a bama and to bring an offering on the outside. That is the mistake that one who builds a bama. The same thing is we're telling to the person who makes a neder. Achinami, nihi derachmona osar alei, dvorim ha'asurim. Let it be the Torah prohibited on you things that are prohibited. But kimoisiv ihu amai de osar rachmona. When you add to what the Torah is asar, pasha, you're guilty. Like they say in the Yerushalmi in the chapter of Pesach, isn't it sufficient to you that which the Torah prohibited you, that you're coming and prohibiting other things on you? Therefore, you are building something which is wrong. It's a bummer because you're doing something besides what Hashem has said. Don't think you're doing a mitzvah. You're doing an aveda. You're building a bummer by asering things that the Torah hadn't asked on you. It's not a mitzvah. The Torah asked only those things it asks. For you to add, you are actually a pesheya. So, what is his guilt over here? Is the guilt is because the person prohibited upon himself? We're explaining what the Ragachover says. By Shvuah, it's the person. But by Neder, it's the object. But here, let's think about it. What are the two possibilities? What we're telling the person? You can say, number one, don't put more prohibitions on yourself. We're talking about the person by making a neder. Or we're telling the person, don't add prohibited things in the world. Don't add objects that are prohibited. It's not just that you prohibiting yourself. You're creating this comparison we can translate in two ways. In what consists the lacking and the sin of the one who is making the vow? He's building this boma. What's this? What's the problem? Aleph impula sagabra. It's the act of the person. Was he asert inyonim was the teirotzi nitge asert. He is prohibiting new things the Torah didn't prohibit it, and he's prohibiting it. That's number one. Number two, beis in the chefza. That the problem is in the object, in the chefza, in the object of this matter. In them was durch sein neder is geworden a chefza shel Yisrael. He created now through his vow a new object which is asur. Was the Torah nit geaser? The Torah did not aser that. Uses a little bit of different style, the two ways. To use a little bit different, in a different way. See that Isur is mitzad hapoel va'apula, is the prohibition of doing it so because of the one who's doing the act, and the act that he's doing is the action, the player, and what the person and what he did, or the mitzad haniflo, that's what he accomplished. So this is when you do an Isser. We're saying you're building a Bama, and we're saying it's the person who is building the Bama doing extra, or you created something extra. And along those same lines, we can say also when we're talking about Hekdesh Bara Mitzvah, as the Rabbi quoted before from the Prisha, that it says that even to create a vow for a mitzvah is as if you're saying, the Eibishter didn't create enough mitzvahs, I'm going to do the mitzvah. Also, we make a vow to give tzedakah, and generally, when we talk about vows of hekdesh, although there is no object of an isur over there, it's not isur. You created actually an object of a mitzvah. The Rebbe explains. So we can say, what's wrong with it? As we brought down from the Prisha, Siv Gimel, that one shouldn't make, even for tzedakah, make new things. Similar to what we say by Nidre Isur. What's the problem by doing it? And the Prisha says it's a problem doing it. Aleph number one, as dos is mitzadem etzem neder. It's for the vow, the person. You shouldn't be adding to the Eibishter's mitzvah. Ma'aseh hagavra, the act of the person. Was that is moisev al mitzvahs Hashem yisbarach. The person is adding to the mitzvahs that the Eibishter gives. He makes himself an additional mitzvah. And as if Mischayiv, V'tzedakah k'yetzba, he obligates himself in tzedakah or similar. Was the Eibishter otim nit mechayiv, and the Eibishter did not obligate. That's one way. And number two, Beis, dosis mitzadan of anifo. It's because what he accomplished over here. By his extra vow of tzedakah, that vow already, if it's your obligation, your assets have to give, you have to pay it up. Your vow becomes, your assets are enslaved to your vow. So you've changed around. You've made now your assets obligated more than their obligation from Hashem. There is a new resting of an obligation of tzedakah on your assets. You have to give your assets, not just your promise, but the assets became obligated. Al derech hanal, b'divrei isur, as er het heeft gemacht, a chefza, you made an object of an isur. Here you make an object of a mitzvah. The Rebbe basically is saying, why do we compare it to a bama? Why is a shvur not compared to a bama? Because over here, you could say that it has to do with the obligation. A shvur is only obligation, but the Rakachover says only neder we compare to a bama, because a neder has also a chefetz, an object. By a shvu, it's only the person. Here we can say one of the two possibilities, and the Rebbe will continue to explain over here. And the Rebbe learns that according to the Rambam, it has actually the building of it. It's the bama. The Rebbe will explain now. You see in the Loshen Rambam, the Rambam doesn't say boine, which would be the act of the person, as in the Gemara. The Rambam says ki lebono, the building, the structure, because according to the Rambam, it's not what the person, what the chiddush of the neder, and why is it like a bama, is because by the person making a neder, he created a chefza, he created a object, and as we'll see later on, that's the difference. Creating an object of Isser is negative, and after you created it, you have to absolve it. But creating an object of a mitzvah, that's not a negative. You don't have to absolve it. That's how the Rebbe will answer. Well, let's go weiter. Hey, apizeh yum tagdiu kaloshin hashas v'Rambam. Both, I said. The sign the Gemara, sign the Rambam. It says ki'ilu bono, as if he built. Not like if he's building. Boma. Nit wie in Shulchan Aruch. In Shulchan Aruch it says, for the Loshen is ki'ilu boine boma. As if he's building a boma. If he's building a boma, yesh lefarshei ki'ilu boine boma shesh farshei. How are we explaining the difference between what it says in Shulchan Aruch, boine boma, and the way the Rambam and the Gemara says, ki'ilu boine boma? The lotion of boine bama, yesh lefarshei, we can explain it. Ki'ilu boine bama is madgish dem chisorin and gabra. That emphasizes the fault in the person. She'oisik b'bniya bilti ritzuya, that he is occupying in a structure, building something which is not desirable. Was can him bring in zum isur akrova b'bama. That might lead him to bringing a korban b'bama, so he shouldn't be building it. The Rambam's October, the Rambam says, however, Ados is ki lebona. If he built already, the Nasis mitzias chefza bama, as if he built a bama, meaning there's already a object of bama. And at gemacht a chefza, he made up an object was a hechsher to hakrova, which is ready to be prepared asura to a prohibited isur. So you see, the Rambam is learning that it's not just the Gavra, but it is the Chefza. Leidem is oich meduyek loshna Rambam. This is also the precise language of the Rambam. V'im avar v'nodar mitzvah lahashil al nidrei. If he did violate and he made the vow, it's a mitzvah for him to absolve himself. Kidei sheloi yei michshel lefonav. So here it says there should be no michshel in front of him, which means a chefza shel, as the Rebbe explains, very beautiful. If the pshat is that he might violate it, like the Radvaz says, if he's not sure if he can fulfill it, he might violate it. The L'choire, loy dem pirush Radvaz and Alsi base. According to the Alsi base, that when the person isn't sure, he might stumble and violate it. As the Michshel is voser vet over sein al nidrei. That the Michshel is because he might violate the vow. Or the Rambam gedav zogen, kidei shelo yovel lidei Michshel. So he shouldn't come to us, not shlo Michshel for before him. Shouldn't come to a Michshel. That's the reason why you have to absolve yourself. Not to come to a stumbling. Nor the mit is the Rambam Madgish. That's what the Rambam here emphasizes with this. Ados is nit mitzada gavra. It's not for the person as ervet kumule takola michshel that he's going to become takola michshel. That's not the problem here. Nor ahisabu shel chefza. When you created an object of isur, you created a stumbling before him. Es wird am Michshel lefonov, the Chefza ha'osur, was hat aufgemacht al yidei nidrei. So we're talking about he created a Michshel lefonov, a Chefza. Not that he is going to fail, but the problem in creating Michshelim through his neder. And a person shouldn't do that. The Eibster gave us the Yisurim and not to create new Cheftzes of Yisur. Why does the Rambam Taki learn that it's because creating an object of Yisur, not so you don't fail? The Tammuz that Rambam learned Tazoi is Mitzadam Gufa. The Rambam that learns this is for this. Because the Gemara zog dos ki ilu bono bamo no begeil neder. Because the Gemara says it's only begeil to neder. Is a siman by a shvua, which is the gavra. There's no bama there, but here by a neder there is a bama. Why? Because the neder makes up the chefza. When it been begeil shvua, ay mitzader ma'isa gavra. If this is like the person doing it is doch haderach zog ben begeil shvua, similar to by shvua. So how come by shvua we don't say Kilabona? So the Rebbe says that according to the Rambam, and the Rambam's Lashon fits well, if we learn that the Isur is not so much for your creating yourself Isurim that you might fail, or even creating Isurim, which the Torah doesn't say, but creating objects of Isurim. And by mitzvahs, to creating objects of mitzvahs. That's what a neder does. And that's what one shouldn't do. And also by a mitzvah, person shouldn't create new objects of mitzvahs, as the Prisha says, not which the Torah didn't tell you to do. So, now, also, the Rebbe explains we understand the difference between Hilchos Deyes and Hilchos Nedarim. In Hilchos Deyes, the Rambam is talking about the person. the gavra, the shvua, neder, everything, not to cause oneself any ways doing about the person, not putting himself in extra prohibition. But here in Hilchos Nedarim, the Rambam is talking about creating, especially this thing which only applies to a neder, a chefzer of a new level of Isur. Vav. Leidem is euch move on der chiluk zwischen Divrei Rambam in Hilchos Deis and Hilchos Nedarim. We also understand the difference between the way in Deis and Hilchos Nedarim. In Hilchos Deis, the Rambam, wegen dem Pulas Hagavra. He talks about here about the act of the person. Was is koilel kamen yonim? Talking about what the person includes many, not talking only about neder, we're talking about various different things. It's Hilchos Deis, laws for the person. Onem dik von der Anoga klolisha prisha medarke oilom. The Rambam talks about a general conduct that people have to separate themselves from the ways of the world, ba'ifun to the way, as lo yachal basar, he doesn't want to eat meat, v'lo yishta yain, he doesn't want to drink wine, v'lo yisa isha, not to marry a woman, not to get married, u'kiyetze b'zehein. Similar. Vos, the Rambam says that's generally bad things. Derech rohi v'asu leilach bo. This is a wrong path. It's prohibited to go in that way. If you go in that way, you're called a sinner. It's a title for the person. It's wrong, the person. Just talking about the person. Because it says by the Nazir, we call him over there, he has to bring a kormechatas because he's considered to be a choyte for not allowing himself. And then he goes into more specific details. Only to hold back from those things the Torah doesn't let you. Don't add to the Torah. Was in them Zainen, the Dorim, or Shavuos B'Shava here, vows and Shavuos, they're all equal. The Rambam is dort Mamshech, as the Rambam continues there. Vorum von der, in their precious Agabra von Dvorim Amotorim, because in separating the person from things that are allowed, is keinaf community be'eza oifum das wird getan. It doesn't matter how it's done. In other words, whether you're trying to stop yourself through a neder, you're trying to stop yourself through a shvua, as far as the person is concerned, if it's permissible and you're prohibiting, then that part of it that the person can't do it, it's one. It doesn't make a difference why you can't do it. That's when we talk about generally about the person. But in Hilchos Nedarim, read the Rambam wegen dem Chisorim mitzad hachefza. Over there he talks about what the neder, the problem and the lacking, the fault over here is that the object you create was that you made up as something which is prohibited. The far zokter davke dorten as kilu bama. You built a bama. You built something unit by Shavuos Kenal. And in the Rambam Hilchos Shavuos, he doesn't bring it down. Because of there, it's only a chefza. Only a gavra, I'm sorry. Only a gavra. But here is the chiddush is chefza. In Hilchos Deis, it's talking about the gavra of Shavuos and the gavra of Nedarim. Anytime, it's the problem with the person. Und das is der Tam, was the Rambam bringt or nicht. This is the reason why the Rambam doesn't bring kol ha-neider. Afal pishem mekayim and nikras heute. The Gemara brings the Gemara in Ayin Zayin, in Chav Beis, in Nedarim, in the beginning of the Sicha, the Gemara is that he's called a chayto, the Nikra Rosh is called a Rosha. Warum in Hilchos Nedarim read the Rambam nor wegen dem Chiddush v'inyan miyochad by Nedarim. Over here is talking about the main Chiddush about Nedarim. We're not talking about the person, he's a Rasha, not a Rasha. He's talking about what he's done to the object. Behind it was the neder macht auf a chefze shel isur. All by nedorim, what we want to talk about is you have created a new object of isur. Und der Fahr kol a neder kilu bama genau. You're building a bama. Mashenkin does was nikra rosha und nikra choite. We call him a sinner. That's not accomplishment of nedorim. That's shvuos. That's sichos deis, but not in neder. Neder's chiddush is that it becomes an object of an isur. Shame over there is shame v'torah gavra. Was is nitkin inyum yuchad ba nedorim. That's not unique to nedorim. Other case, one who sits in a fast is called a sinner because that's a person's doing. It's only the gavra. It's not a chefta. Also called a chayte. But a neder creates a chefta shalism. And the idea of this inyan, the chayt by nedorim mitzad gavra. This idea that the person, when he makes a vow, he's also the person is a problem. That he brings in ilchos deis. That's in those of deis. Not in ilchos nedorim, but in ilchos deis, because that's also a problem. But that's equal with shvuos. Bring tak the ram ilchos deis as am halach b'derech zu. One who works in this path. In the Gemaras that the Rebbe wanted, asked why the Ram doesn't bring Nedorim. He doesn't bring down Nedorim because that's not the unique about Nedorim. Nedorim is about the Chefza. About the Gavra, the Rambam brings down Hilchos Deis. As Amala, but there is Peidish Vinyon Ha'ilon. One who goes in this path and he separates himself from worldly matters, Dikra Chayte is called a sinner. And then a continuation to that. And that's why the Chachamim instructed. Also Nedorim V'Shvuos, Advarim HaMotorim Chulu. Whether it's Nedorim V'Shvuos, that's we're talking about the person himself, the Yisugavra. And this is also those who always fast. And the Chachamim prohibited Shiodom Sagiv Atzav V'Tainis, that a person should torture himself in tightness. So the Rebbe brings down in the Rambam over here, we're only talking about Kilu Bono. Bono. That's only unique to Nedorim. That's the unique aspect of Nedorim that he creates a chefza. As opposed to Hilchos Shvuos, and over there, it's not a Bono. That doesn't apply. As the Ragachavi brought down, the Rebbe said before, the whole idea is here. In Hilchos Deis, the Rambam brings about the other aspect of what it's compared to by Nebama that Ran says that the person prohibited himself more things that he shouldn't. This explains all the above. Now, the thing left to explain is what about Nidre Isur that the Rebbe asked? This is all an introduction. How come the Rambam doesn't say that he should ask and try to absolve himself from the Nidre mitzvah, hekdesh, tzedakah? That's too, seems like the Rambam says you shouldn't do it in the beginning to create. But the Rebbe says, since we're talking about now that you created, when you made a vow for an Isur, you created a Chefza Shel Isur. That's why you should get it away as soon as possible, the Chefza. But when you create a vow, and you create an obligation, as we said before, on the object, on your money, on your assets that you have to give to tzedakah now, that's not something that you should absolve, because this is not, you didn't create a mitzvah, you created a mitzvah. So although we shouldn't create mitzvahs, but now we can't say that you created the mitzvah and therefore you shouldn't absolve it, that the Rebbe explains now in Ois Zion. Ois Zion. Because Zevet man verstehen am Chiluk zwischen Nidre Isur Based on all of the above, we'll understand the difference between a neder of an isur and a neder of a hektish. By nidre isur is durch sein neder geworden a hefze shel isur. You make a vow of an isur, the object that you created is an object of isur. Gemacht a hefze, so therefore you made up an object. A michshel lefanov. The Rambam says you made up a stumbling before you. Und the riber is mitzvah l'shol al nidrei, and that's why it's a mitzvah to ask and absolve the neder kadesh lo yeh michshel lefanov. So you don't have the michshel that you created in front of you. Mashenke by nidre hegdish as opposed to nidre hegdish, hat sein neder geschaffen, your neder created nit a hefze shel isur, not an object of prohibition, nor adrabe. On the contrary, achalois chiv shel tzedakah. You made a rest here of an obligation of tzedakah. Okay, it's a b'shar hegdishes. Same thing as other hegdish, whether it's tzedakah, other hegdishes. Und the riber is the hefze nit an inyan for mitzvah lefanov. That object is not considered to be a stumbling before you. Adrabe, it's not a michshel. It's a hefze shel mitzvah. You made an object of a mitzvah. Mitzvah lekaimer. It's a mitzvah to fulfill it. Und das ist euch der Diuk in dem Zustand. This is also the precise comparison to Keilu Bona Boma, to building a Boma, which means that it doesn't necessarily mean that a Boma is going to be used for the wrong way. You could use it the wrong way, but you could use it for the right way too. Binyan Boma, if he's building a high place, not for something which is prohibited, isn't it ken isur? There's no isur of building a bama for a platform. So it's not a hechsher zu p'ulos bebama v'chakena zayin an isur. You're only preparing to such activity in the bama which could be a prohibition. Hakravas korban. You can bring a korban which would be an isur. Or a mitzvah. But you can also, the preparation could also be a mitzvah. Maybe it's mokum kovid laviv rabbi, an honorable place, a platform, so your father or your teacher can be at. You're building for them. Kriya b'Torah, you're reading in the Torah from a platform. Amiras divreis oidres mokum gavoya, to speak words of encouragement from a high place. Kilshoina kosuf. Pasuk says, al har gavoya liloch. Go up on a large mountain, harimi b'koyach koylach, and raise your voice with strength. So we see going up in a high place to scream out what needs to be done. So that could be for negative, or maybe just ordinary for something which is optional and plain, not a mitzvah, not an avera, and just plain thing. So this is by the mitzvah, by the making the neder, you built a bama. We don't know exactly how this goes. Und der Rebbe bringt don nicht der Rambam den Posuk meforish. He doesn't bring when he says that you should follow what your mitzvah. If you did, you should do. If you do the mitzvah, you should come through with it. Why doesn't he bring the specific posuk? It says very clear posuk. What comes out of your mouth, you should do. And you should do as you vowed. That's why you should say, not just Nedore La Hashem Hashalom. You should say, you have to do what you promised. As a mitzvah min ha-Torah, as Omekayim Zayin Nidre, it's a positive mitzvah of the Torah to fulfill his vow. The Rambam sagt früher, as the Rambam said before. What does the Rambam say? But the Rambam says, nor, since this is a vow to Hashem, das ist nicht sein eigener Isur v'chiyuv. It's not his own Isur v'chiyuv, not like prohibiting something. Nor das is as opposed to making Isurim This has become an object, geworden an inyan Hashem. The Rebbe is Hashalom. The Rambam wants to emphasize it's not just an obligation on the person. It is because the chalois is geworden, it became a matter of La Hashem. And that's why Hashalom, that's why you have to pay it. And that's why the Rambam brings it down. So therefore, over here, if you made an object of a mitzvah, you made the neder, it became La Hashem. You made it a chefetz of La Hashem. So you shouldn't make that vow. Because as the Parisha says, don't add to the Torah, but once you add it, you included it into the mitzvahs of Hashem. It's become the Dor of Hashem. It's not just an obligation to do it. It became a chefetz shel mitzvah, and therefore Hashalom, you must do it. And don't absolve yourself and don't try to get away from it. It's not a stumbling. You didn't create a stumbling. You created a mitzvah. The Rebbe concludes now Ches Benegei Yinshas Man Groma Zayin de Nechemta, which is the 7 weeks of comfort. Der Shvu von the Meibishn of Hereinbring in Eden and Eretz Yisrael. Hashem's Shvua to bring Yidden, his promise in his Shvua to bring Yidden Eretz Yisrael. Bechlalik der Geula, and generally to redeem us. Is doch an Inyan was der Eibishter hat maftiach, and that's something that God promised. Und noch mehr, not only there's a promise, sich gebunden durch dem, und noch mehr sich gebunden Kaviyochel, mit der Shvua, he tied himself with a oath. Und noch mehr, and more than just an oath, durch dem, hat sich das aufgetan in der Chefze der Olam. And through Hashem's, not only a Shvua, but it accomplished in the object of the world. The Eibishter says in the Shvaiti, he swore for the Yid. The Eibishter's words is a Maisa. Mitzad der Metzius von Welt, Monzich, the world's existence demands. As Yidden soll allein in Eretz Yisrael, Yidden should enter Eretz Yisrael. Und es soll kommen die Gula Amidis Vashlema der Mashiach Tzidkenu, that there shall come the true and complete redemption through our righteous Mashiach. Und der Riber, and therefore, we nor Yidden will tshuvaton. As soon as we'll do repent, we'll do tshuva, smiyad hinegol immediately will be redeemed. Und es is nitshayich keine meniyus v'yikuvim, and there is nothing to prevent and hold back, chas v'sholem, mitzad epis in Welt, anything in the world. The Adrabah, because of the contrary, Welt, Gufa, Mont. The world itself demands is al kumen di geula. The redemption should come, on kumen b'meir b'meir mamish, to come very quickly in our days. This is Shabbos Parsha Sichos, Api Sichos, Chof Aleph Menachem Ov Tavshin Dalad Mem. Interesting lashon. Alpi Sichos, Chof Aleph Menachem Ov Tavshin Dalad Mem. It is, of course, a very pilpul and a lot of concept and a lot of there's full with ha'aris over here, even more. But it's good for a first time, and certainly review to really try to fully understand the points that the Rebbe makes here. Ba'atzlacha.